Andy, welcome to the Health Path podcast. It's really nice to connect after a few weeks now since you came to my home and did sort of an evaluation.
Thank you, Alex. It's been, I said, some time. I wanted to touch base at the time and find out how you got on with the recommendations that I'd made. So we can talk about that later, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, we can potentially use me as a little bit of a case study in regards to what you do and what you're looking for and some of the recommendations that you might make. But before we dive into that, are you happy just to do a little bit of an introduction to you and to Action Dry?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I've been in damage management for virtually all my working life since 1975. So I have a lot of expertise in regards to water damage and drying of water damaged buildings and the proliferation and remediation of mold within buildings and other contaminations as well. From damage management, the original business, which ran from 1975 to 1996, we included a lot of validation work for insurance companies on floor covering claims. But we realized probably in the early 90s that there was more of an issue emerging regarding mold. And in 1996, we decided to focus purely on water damage and mold. And even though doors of opportunity have arisen, we have decided not to go through the doors of opportunity and just stay with what we feel we're good at, water damage and mold. We have spent a lot of time, money and resources investigating the decontamination of mold from buildings, and we've put together a science and evidence-based program of works, which we believe is industry leading in the UK. Might be industry leading in the world, I don't know. But we believe that we need, where people are reporting health issues, to ensure that we do the best job that can be possibly undertaken. So we try and build up trust with our clients, and we have a degree of knowledge. We have scientists within the company. We've undertaken training all over the world, having sent technicians to America to become ACAC certified microbial restorers and consultants. We had a team go out to Australia a few years ago before the lockdown to investigate a new process for mold removal. We're not a team that will just accept what manufacturers say. We'll do our own due diligence. We will look into things, and we will look to see if we can improve what is being stated, if it works. For instance, we took on the Goldmore process, which is a world-leading mold remediation process, which involves removal of mold and the improvement of air quality. Okay, so we looked at that process and thought, well, how can that be improved? So through a lot of research and testing, we have a training house, a research centre in Upminster in Essex, which we can flood, dry, we can make mouldy if we want to or whatever. We did a lot of research on equipment that would work in synergy with the process. And we believe that the process that we now have, which is working in synergy, will provide really the best solution for removal of mold and mold issues within a property. But it's a minefield, and it's a rabbit warren. It's very, very difficult because there are no dose response thresholds, so people react differently to different doses. So as there are no thresholds set, one has to use the science and the evidence to really inform the decision-making process. no home could be made totally mold free, unfortunately, or even mycotoxin free necessarily. But we do our best to bring back down levels of contamination to the lowest practical levels. The difficult thing is the expectations of customers, you know, who are expecting a home to be made safe. We can't do that, because we're not doctors, and we cannot say your home is now safe to go back into. So we use the words normality. We like to bring the home back to normality. And there's two types of decontamination process, really, because many people can live exposed to mold and mycotoxins, then they can live quite normally. So where there's a small level of mold, it might be that they want to do it themselves, or if they had us do it, they'll just want the very basic service of removing the visible mold. Okay, but where people are reporting health issues, or where there are major concerns for health implications, we have to go beyond. Okay, and what we look to do there is use the science and the evidence to prove efficacy of whatever works have been undertaken, and to show people how big an improvement there has been within their home. And we have found from many years now that most people believe this to be probably the best way forward for them. We can't say that Mrs. Smith coming into her property after a remediation is not going to, you know, to perhaps have any sort of effect. We can't say that. As I said, we're not doctors, and even the smallest level of contamination of the wrong sort of mold or mycotoxin might set that client off. So, as I said, it's a rabbit warren and a minefield. So we have to be careful what we say and what we do. But I believe we do a fair job with integrity.
Yeah, absolutely. Having had personal experience, I can vouch for that, and also your vast knowledge in this area as well, which you shared with me.
Thank you.
But I guess, you know, our listeners, some of them might obviously have a lot of visible mold in their properties. So there are two questions that come up that I think could be helpful to explore. One of them is, just in your experience, what are some of the sort of symptoms or health conditions that people have suspected have been connected with their exposure? And the second one is, are there any signs or symptoms from a building perspective if there isn't visible mold? So are there things that we could be looking out for in regards to this?
Well, in terms of the symptoms, I mean, the viewers will know from probably their own research that there's various types. I mean, the symptoms relating to mold exposure can be, you know, said to be the cause, you know, caused by other contaminations or exposures or whatever. You know, even just by poor air quality, perhaps. So it's, as I said, it's a rabbit warren and a minefield. And what we say to people is that if we come in and do a decontamination, we can't always guarantee that when you walk in, you still won't experience a reaction, because it might not be the mold that is setting you off. Usually, most people go down the route of dealing with mold as the first stage in their route to recovering their building and their health. So when we get referrals from people like yourselves, then we will go and speak to the client and try and ascertain, you know, what their concerns are and discuss with them. And we've been on the phone for several hours to people, because most people with health issues want answers. And every time you answer a question, it elicits several more questions, and you can spend a lot of time on the phone talking to people, and still find, you know, later on down the line that what you've said has not been understood fully. So it is difficult. So the second part of your question, if you just repeat that, Alex, because
Yeah, just sort of, I guess from your perspective, but for our listeners as well, what sort of things might you be looking for when you're walking around a home
okay.
to kind of suspect whether there could be a mold issue?
Well, the difficulty there is if we walked into a home that's been recently decorated, and we've had this quite recently on a couple of jobs where the people want to buy a home which is mold free. So we will go in, they'll ask us to do an assessment. We'll go in and the place is absolutely pristine. It's all been decorated. It looks fantastic. And you do a MoldScope assessment, which is the technology we use for the initial assessments. And I'll go into that a little bit later. And the MoldScope comes up green in every room, okay, indicating that everywhere is normal. And then perhaps a little bit down the line, we'll get a phone call saying, well, we found some mold. So they wonder, how can that be? So what we found recently was that with the period of hot weather in the UK, okay, there wasn't much outside water penetrating into the homes. So the unscrupulous seller might decide to take that opportunity to redecorate and sell the house. Okay, so as I said, it looks pristine, and then when we have the rains, as we did do a couple of weeks ago, we found water coming into, or our clients found water coming into their property, and obviously, you know, set the bells ringing. So that was a concern. But normally what we would look for is evidence of water damage, discoloration of paintworks, pickling of the paint off walls, perhaps swelling of timber or MDF components. So anything there, even odors, you know, when we initially walk into the property, we'll have the scientist or the lead technician who operates the MoldScope, and then we'll have another technician who's a water damage technician looking around for evidence of water damage, which we will then, as you know, put into a report, which you can act on or not act on if you don't want to, but we would always advise, if there is water damage, to secure the source, get the building dry, and deal with the mold that's resulted from that incident. Okay, so that's the most important thing. Mold won't grow without water. You need water. And now you can get free water from escapes of water, leaks, water coming in from the outside. You can also get it as a result of dew point condensation, environmental living conditions. So we will talk to the clients about the ventilation in their property. Okay, some types of property are meant to be ventilated just by the way they're built. Others are all closed up and need mechanical ventilation. A lot of the time we find the mechanical ventilation is not put in properly. Okay, it might vent to the loft rather than the outside, or the ductwork has been put in the wrong way around, which we've seen a few times. So there's a lot of things that we will look for when we're going, and for the homeowner or the property owner, they need to be looking for evidence of water damage, just stains, discolorations to paint, you know, mold growing on surfaces. I mean, that's a good indicator that there's a moisture problem, of course. Okay.
Yeah.
So I suppose I've mentioned the MoldScope, and people are probably wondering, what is the MoldScope? It's a technology which was developed by the military, or for the military, to detect anthrax in real time. It was declassified probably about 12 years ago, and it was allowed to be commercialized, and the company that took on the license to commercialize it decided to use it for mold investigations. And it's a pretty nifty piece of kit, which is very robust. It uses biofluorescence of the mold spores to identify the mold species and then compare those species against a database of molds, which includes some of the ERMI, the Environmental Relative Mold Index species. Okay, so it will quantify what it finds and give a red, amber, green result, with the green being what we classify as normal. Okay, so when we do a decontamination of a property, so the initial investigation will perhaps throw up several rooms which are red, which are abnormal, rooms which might be yellow, which again are abnormal, or green rooms, or a combination of them all. So we can, using that technology, really determine where the hot spots lie in the property. So for instance, it might be a bathroom, or it might be the bedroom, or it might be a sofa in the living room, because the MoldScope can do some near source testing. We can tap and aerosolize what's on a soft furnishing and just see what's picked up. So we can kind of fine tune the target area of where we want to work. It might be the whole house, and where people are reporting health issues, usually they want to consider cleaning the whole house because they've read and they fear that the mold could be everywhere, or the mycotoxins could be everywhere. Okay, the MoldScope doesn't pick up mycotoxins. There are separate tests for that, but the MoldScope will pick up the fungal concentrations, and from that, give us guidance on where we need to be targeting our efforts in the initial stages. Okay.
So am I right in saying that initially, and that's the device that you used at my house, right?
Yes, correct.
Yeah. So kind of, am I right in saying that initially the traffic light system is referring to the amount of mold spores that are being detected? And
yes, it's
analyzed.
Yeah, indeed, and the types. It's not just measuring the number of spores. It's actually identifying the species. There's about 80 different species within the database, the developers database, of which I said a large number are on the ERMI index. So it will identify those. It'll also identify outliers, okay, molds that you wouldn't normally expect or see, okay, within the property, because the home usually has perhaps, I think it's about 10 molds that are considered normal, that you'd expect in any sort of kind of degree or number. But the presence of the ERMI molds would indicate to us some level of water damage, and that the number of molds or mold spores, or the concentrations within the ERMI part of the index, would guide us as to whether there is some sort of abnormality.
Okay. And are you happy just to expand on the ERMI for people that don't yet know what that is?
Yeah, well, the ERMI is it's an index developed by Stephen Vesper in the States. Oh, I think it might be Canada. I might be wrong there, but he put together the Environmental Relative Mold Index, okay, which is a rating practice really, which allows it classifies houses as to whether or not they're water damaged, okay, and it quantifies the levels of molds in two categories: the water damage indicator species, group 1, and the normal household molds, group 2. So it's an experimental kind of index. It's not to be relied on, but I believe that every bit of information has a use. Okay, we can, from the ERMI, bring in Dr. Schumacher's Hurts Me Too and calculate a score from that. He's determined that 5 of the species in the ERMI index are particularly relevant to people who may be reporting health issues. So he's put together an index on that, okay, which he kind of says would determine whether a home is safe to reoccupy for someone with CIRS, chronic inflammatory response syndrome. Now, again, you have to treat all this with a pinch of salt. It works for some people, perhaps not for others. You can only believe that Dr. Schumacher has done a lot of research, and he's absolutely confident in his index and scores. So I'm not going to argue with him. He's got a lot more expertise. He's a medical doctor. I'm not. I'm a remediator. So we leave it to the people to look at that and perhaps present it to their health practitioner, so that you can make sense as a health practitioner of the results. Okay, but if for instance, with the HERTSME score, we have a result that shows it's safe to go back in, then that's good news. It's more information for the occupant of the house, you know, the client perhaps, in making their decisions on whether to sell a house, move back in, whether or not the clean's been good enough for them or whatever.
Okay, perfect. And is there anything else, Annie, that you would like to share in regards to your sort of investigations? Any other kind of techniques or gadgets that you have?
Well, we have a whole host. We can undertake virtually every type of test imaginable.
Okay.
We have our own laboratory where we can undertake perhaps respirable mycotoxin testing using ELISA. We can include within a site test a thing called IAQA, Indoor Air Quality Analytics, which was developed by an Australian team of scientists to compare air quality against standards and thresholds in the indoor air. Because unfortunately, in the UK, there's no indoor air quality thresholds or standards, and everyone tends to use the outside air quality, the IAQ index, which is not really appropriate to indoor air, because as we know, indoor air can be a lot more contaminated than the outside air, especially lately with the lockdown and everyone spending more time indoors. So the IAQA is a great tool. It gives again a red, green, well, it gives actually a multicolored index, and there are several kind of layers to it, and it gives quite a nice report. I haven't got a report here. If I could share a screen, I could show you, but perhaps another time. But we can do the IAQs, but we can undertake mycotoxin testing, environmental mycotoxin testing. We can do actinomycetes, human bacteroids, a whole range of other tests, spore counts, whatever suits, because all testing has its limitations, and it's understanding those limitations as an expert in remediation that is important to the client, so that if, for instance, we're using the MoldScope, we know that even though it speciates, it doesn't speciate on the report. It just quantifies the fungal concentration. So where someone is ill and we're remediating a property, to us, what we need to be doing is determining whether or not there are water damage indicator species there that shouldn't be there in any sort of number or volume. Okay, so we would undertake a DNA test alongside the MoldScope. I mean, sometimes as well, where people have had water damage, which is a claimable, maybe a claimable event, say for instance, they've had an escape of water and the insurers have brought in a company, one of their preferred suppliers, to return the home back to levels compliant with the British Standard Publicly Available Specification number 64, which is the code of practice for the mitigation and recovery of water damaged buildings. Okay, those companies should be providing drying certificates, surface hygiene and air quality certificates, and invariably they only provide a drying certificate. So insurers are cherry picking the drying certificate, okay, and ignoring air quality and surface hygiene. So that could be a problem, because what we're finding is delays in progressing works, delays in or inadequacy of the drying program can result in significant mold growth. And we're having to sometimes prove to insurers that mold that can be seen is either the result of or contributed to by the water damage event. And we can do that with the DNA. And say Stachybotrys has proliferated in the room that has that was flooded, but if we tested other parts of the house, we can also find a correlation, because, for instance, Stachybotrys is found in several other rooms as well. So we can then say to the insurers, well, look, the whole house now needs to be decontaminated, which is obviously a blessing for the occupant, because if they're suffering health issues, then they need to have their home brought back to a condition which is normal. And that our goal is to return a property to condition 1, which is stated in the IICRC's S520 mold standard. Okay, so we use that standard. We use the British Standard PAS 64 to guide our works, and we try to ensure that everything we do is documented, so that at any stage we can fulfill any argument. Okay, so again, it can be quite in depth, and the more you get into it, and the more educated the client is, the more they want to know about how it's done, what you're doing, how it should be interpreted. And that can take a lot of time and a lot of emails. You know, I mean, in some instances, I've had 500 emails from clients over the course of perhaps a year, 2 years of operation, because that's another thing, is insurance companies in particular can take a very long time to bring about the full remediation of a severely water damaged property. Okay, which is perhaps had some mold damage. It's you know, the people don't understand that. I mean, unfortunately, there are agendas out there to keep a lid on mold. And what we're beginning to understand from work with Australian scientists is that the levels of mycotoxins in water damage remediated homes can be in excess of levels set by the World Health Organization in their codex for food mycotoxin thresholds. So that's a big concern, and I think sometime down the line we might see legislation being put in time.
I missed you for 10 seconds, Andy. What do you think we're going to see?
Legislation being brought in
for
damage management contractors.
Okay.
I believe that as people understand that perhaps more so than mold spores, I mean, all mold is allergenic, some are toxigenic, okay, some are pathogenic, but in terms of mycotoxins, they're known to be to cause some severe issues, and that's why they're legislated for in foodstuffs. So it would make sense that if damage management contractors are increasing the level of it should be done to prevent them doing that, or to prove that at the end of their works the levels are not of concern.
Yeah, okay.
Or reduced to the lowest practical levels. Excuse me.
That's good, and that's really relevant. I think, you know, certainly the practitioners listening in are going to be familiar with urinary mycotoxin testing, and that's something that we do in clinic quite a lot. So I'm wondering, can you discuss from your perspective mycotoxin testing? Because I'm wondering whether, if we're seeing it in the urine, does it make sense that someone might then want to have a home evaluated for mycotoxins to get that correlation? Yeah,
well, most people will be referred to either Great Plains or Real Time. The Great Plains do the urine sampling analysis. Real Time do one as well. I think what people need to understand is potentially that the mycotoxins that are present in the urine could be the result of diet. okay, as well as environmental exposure. So we would normally recommend perhaps a month or 2 months down the line after treatment has started, if you start your treatment, for instance, to remove those mycotoxins, that they retest so that they can see if there's an improvement. And if there was, carry on, keep going, because it would indicate that the exposure may have been through something that was eaten, and that your treatment was working. But if, for instance, there was no reduction in the level of mycotoxins, then you might think, well, hang on, perhaps time now to think about environmental mycotoxin test. And an environmental mycotoxin test can be undertaken, and sample analysis results. So if they're the same, then you can think, well, hang on a minute, there might be an issue here in the environment, so your house may need clean. Okay, because if you're treating someone and, for instance, you've got ochratoxin within the environmental sample, every time you walk back into that property. So what we're looking to do, reduce the levels, if possible, get rid of all the mycotoxins that are present in that property. And again, that's not an easy target, but there are products and processes out there that we have spent a lot of time with and find work really well. Okay, so when we finish a remediation, we will usually undertake an environmental mycotoxin test and possibly a respirable mycotoxin test, so that we can again show the occupant, the client, that their exposure is going to be reduced to the lowest practical levels. And that's on top of things like the MoldScope testing or any other testing that might be appropriate to that particular job.
Okay. And I think, you know, we're starting to understand why you can be on the phone for hours with with potential clients.
Yeah.
So many
Yeah, for sure. Some people are very educated on the matter and go into things with a really fine tooth comb and come back to us, you know, with nitpickingly kind of, or nitpicking questions. And but I understand that, and we're there to try and help. So I don't say, well, that's a stupid question, you know, or I can't spend the time doing that. We'll go back and we will research. And, you know, we get emails or questions from people, one-liners, and then you look at that one line and you think, because you know it's going to take 2 days to research it and come up with the answer. But we build up a database, and that's what we've been doing over the years. We've built up our knowledge base, our expertise on the whole thing. So we can answer and satisfy most people now. There's not many people, I don't know any that we've not been able to satisfy, you know, because we know what we're doing. So,
yeah. And I think that's really important just to share, because I'm not going to sort of name drop, but I've certainly referred some old clients to a company whereby they come, they do a great inspection, but then you're ultimately just left with a 70-page report that makes no sense to the person who owned the house. And they're kind of then emailing me saying, Alex, well, what does this mean? What do I now do? And we're all just left in the dark. So to know that there's that sort of follow-up interaction, I think, is really important.
Yeah, well, as a remediator, what we're looking to do is make things easy for people to understand. That's why we do everything red, amber, green, so to speak, because we want people to look at that at a glance and see they've got a problem or they haven't got a problem. Okay, and they can discuss that with us anytime. So we can make very scientific reports, and we're often engaged by clients who are having arguments with insurance companies over conditions in their homes, and the insurers are using experts who put these reports together, as you say, 70 pages long, full of, science, which no one can understand. And that's why they've done them like that, because they know no one can understand them. So we try to make it as simple as we can. And I think it works. It is easy, but what we do is robust. So at any stage, we can actually ensure that if it went to court, we can show how robust our kind of whole service is. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's comforting for us to know.
Yeah, for sure. We will try very hard to go over and above and beyond if it's appropriate. I mean, we're not driven. I mean, we're a commercial operation, but we're not driven necessarily by the dollar. We look, to help people, and I believe, I hope, I like to think I've got a level of integrity, and I think, I've got a reputation for integrity. That's not to say I can't make mistakes. Everyone can make mistakes, but if we did make a mistake, we'd be on it like a shot. Yeah. But generally, we don't really make mistakes. But we do get issues, as I said lately, where new houses can obscure results and give people or lull people into a false sense. Well, it looks great, and it's not. So that's an emerging issue. I think as more and more people get aware, okay, of the implications of mold in properties, they will be doing what they can to cover up the evidence when it comes to the point of perhaps selling their home.
Yeah, absolutely.
That can be a problem. Yeah. So I mean, we've actually been working with the housing association now for probably close on a year, with regard to providing handover certificates, so that we can provide a certificate which shows that the property is dry, that there is the fungal concentrations are normal, or that the air quality is normal, or that surface hygiene on the critical surface is again normal. And it's a simple kind of thing to do, but it's getting a lot of interest now with the housing associations. The big fight for us is obviously cost of that. We want to drive that down as low as we can. So I think that's our next challenge. Make it something that people, with homes can use as part of their handover pack. Yeah,
amazing. I mean, is there anything else, Andy, that you think would be helpful for our listeners to know about? I mean, you shared, for example, some fascinating case studies that you had worked on in regards to, I guess, investigating homes and some of the remediation that had to happen.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's loads. I mean, two in particular come to mind. One was up in Doncaster, where a river had gone through the house in the flooding a few years ago, and we were asked to go and decontaminate and dry the property. A simple job, relatively low cost for what was involved, but the insurer said, no, you're not one of our preferred suppliers, we'd like to use our preferred supplier. Well, the policyholder was quite happy, and we said, well, okay, as long as they do the job properly, come back to us if you have any issues. Sure enough, she came back to us. She said, I'm not really happy. They've left the property. It looks and smells damp, and we can see mold. So we went up and tested, did a report which indicated the property was still wet and there was still mold present. The insurers had insisted that people get back into the property. So the people were living in the property. The daughter was ill. And we entered into a battle with the insurance companies, who sent their experts down to argue what we were saying. And they were coming up with absolutely stupidity, saying that we can see mold in the bathroom, we can see mold on the windows, on the wall here. And by the way, later on the report, they would be saying there's no mold, the property's safe to go back into. Well, as I said, they're not doctors, they can't say it's safe, but how can they contradict what they previously said, that there's mold and then there's no mold? still the insurers wouldn't accept what we were saying. They called in another expert. We were able to show that their report was better, and it came up to the conclusions that it needed to be decontaminated, but it was still full of holes because they're relying on colony forming units culturing, which is only about 10% efficient. Okay, it doesn't identify the non-viable, and the more aggressive molds overgrow, the less kind of they agreed that we could go in and clean the house, and what was in fact a reasonable cost ended up with all the contents having to be removed again, cleaned in an off-site facility and tested whilst the house was being decontaminated, and the occupants had to be put up as a family of 5 in alternative accommodation, and it was about probably 2 months that they were out of the property, and it cost the insurers probably 10 times as much. Crazy. And another property in Devon where it looked an absolutely pristine house, absolutely, a single elderly lady. It looked beautiful, but she was very ill. She had cancer. So she phoned us up saying she was really concerned. So we went down, did an assessment with the MoldScope, and found levels that we'd never seen in a house before, levels running into millions of fungal concentration. So we engaged with the insurance companies, who accepted that we could go down and open up the floor to have a look and see what was underneath. What had happened, the dishwasher had been leaking over a long period, and mold had proliferated in the subfloor void and underneath the dishwasher. So we were engaged to decontaminate the property. After big arguments, again, they were calling in other experts, other decontamination specialists. I mean, there's a lot of people there offering mold remediation with just fogging, which is not really cutting the mustard. It's not good enough. Okay, you have to remove the mold. So we were engaged to go down after a lengthy battle, and we decontaminated the property. All the contents were removed. All the floors were opened up, all the subfloor voids cleaned, the properties cleaned, the roof space, insulation removed, a major job. And we advise insurers, get on with the remediation or the reinstatement as quickly as you can. And what did they do? They started arguing about price with their remediation or reinstatement contractors. 4 months down the line, they still hadn't reinstated, and it was winter, and it was our winters are quite damp now. So we'd advise them to put in heating and drying equipment, dehumidifiers, whilst they were arguing. They didn't do it. So 4 months down the line, some mold appeared, and the lady was absolutely mortified. We were called in again. We found further high levels. So the insurers agreed to pay for cleaning again. This happened 4 times, 4 times, before finally they got their backsides into gear and started to reinstate the house. But in the meantime, I think her alternative accommodation bill, she's only just gotten back into the house. This started 3 years ago. Her alternative accommodation bill is in the region of 75,000, let alone, okay, the costs on the house. And in fact, there was talk about them knocking down the house and rebuilding it.
Wow.
Okay, that's how bad it had gotten. But eventually we brought it back to normality, and it got reinstated, and she's now back in, and she's found a big improvement in her health. So that's pleasing to know. I'm really pleased that we've been able to help. But that was a big challenging job, that. And the lady herself was a researcher, so she knew how to answer the questions, or to research, her questions. And she wanted the ins and outs of everything. And again, that was a lady I referred to, 500 emails, huge amount. And they're not just, one-line emails. They're like 30-page long emails in strings. So when you have a question 2 years down the line, and you've got to refer to previous information sent, it becomes a nightmare because you've got to go through every single email to make sure what you're saying correlates. And that's takes time, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So most of our time in the office is spent either researching or just dealing with the client's questions. It's bloody hard work.
Yeah, I can imagine. That is,
it's a challenge sometimes as well.
yeah.
Yeah.
Andy, I think I'm sort of mindful of your time, and I think what you've shared today is so valuable and so important. I get both many people in the general public, but also practitioners asking me in regards to what companies I recommend for having homes tested. And I think your conversation, your company, obviously having had first-hand experience with you as well, is doing such a brilliant job in such an important area from our perspective. So thank you for coming on, for sparing some time. And
yeah, no problem. What I would say, Alex, is if anyone does have an issue or a problem, pick up the phone. I mean, we're there. We don't charge for our time. Come and talk to us. We'll gladly give some guidance. Even if they want to do things themselves, we can still give guidance and perhaps help people.
Brilliant. And yeah, I'll add all of those details to the show notes so people will be able to contact you directly.
Fantastic. Thank you. Alex, nice talking to you and seeing you again.
Likewise. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you. Cheers. Take care.